Like what we're doing here at Cube for Two? Click the like and subscribe button to let us know. Also, Cube for Two is now a Tcgplayer affiliate. Click the link in the show notes for all your shopping needs to help support the channel. Alright guys, let's get started. What's good, Cubers? It's your boy Matt, and this week I have something special for you. It's no secret that I have more than one cube because I value a lot of different play experiences, so this week I managed to sit down and talk with Mike Petschek from the Pauper Cube about the play experience from his cube. I actually maintain a copy of it myself, and I didn't even know it when I asked him to sit down, but the Pauper Cube is about to be featured at Magic Online, so if you want the inside scoop on the Pauper Cube, its histories, the archetypes therein, and how to approach a Pauper Cube style draft, today's episode is all about you. To start us off, Mike, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the history of the Pauper Cube, and I know it started with Adam. If you could just tell us a little bit about the Pauper Cube and kind of where it originated.
Stibbs actually shared a pretty complete history of the cube on my old podcast, Color Commentary, but the brief rundown of the history of the Pauper Cube is that it started in Stibbs' possession, and a bunch of people local to him had cubes in the early days of cubing, and he wanted to do something different from what already was existing in his local area, and sort of settled on this gold-centric all commons list. I believe it coincided roughly with the release of Shards of Alara. And after he got that list out there, people started noticing it. They started copying it and replicating it. So he would publish articles at various places. I believe for a while he was at Cool Stuff Inc., but eventually wound up going solo in the early spring of 2018. And after that, there was the formation of the Discord, and that's really how I got to know Stibbs. And then not too long ago, he actually took up an official position at Wizards of the Coast, and as a result wanted to have the cube continue to live on, but didn't want to devote the time to personally updating it every single time a new set came out. There's a blog post on the site that sort of goes into the reasons that the various committee members were chosen, but yeah, it was honestly a huge honor when he initially asked me, because this was the project that got me into cubing.
That's pretty freaking sweet. So now you're a member of the Pauper Cube committee. I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about the committee itself and the paupercube.com, like how many members of you guys are there? How often do you guys do updates? Tell us a little bit about that.
So the committee is reasonably informal. There's 3 members, and we generally try to focus our updates to the cube around set releases, even though in this day and age there's more sets than you can shake a stick at, but we try to stick with major releases, so nothing really smaller than a master's set. We're obviously always discussing in between updates things that would be nice, back and forth about exactly what archetype support we want to use and whether we want to sort of guide the cube in a specific direction for one of its color pairs. But yeah, the behind the scenes is a small reduced down version of the film 12 Angry Men, in that it's the 3 of us, and occasionally Stibbs will still join in, even as a non-member of the committee. He'll come in and share some opinions, and we'll generally go back and forth. We actually had to delay the Theros Beyond Death updates by about a week because we were continuing to sort of go through and iterate over and over again. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to work on a cube with not only other people, but on top of that, knowing that there's an audience out there that we want as many of them to enjoy the cube as possible.
Actually, a good point. One of my favorite things about the Pauper Cube is I maintain a lot of cubes, and now that I've got this channel, I'm really busy. And so while I used to be on the Discord a lot more and watching and reading and contributing to the conversation, I don't really have the time for that anymore, but I do still get cube updates with every set because I can check in on the paupercube.com and see what the updates have been and make those changes to my personal cube, which means it's one less cube for me to have to maintain rigorously and comb each set for new additions every single time Wizards releases a new product, which will probably be any minute now because they like to drop one, every 3 or 4 days. Mike, you mentioned that you're designing the cube for a larger audience now. How many people do you think maintain a copy of the Pauper Cube itself?
I've thought about the number of people who've actually built the cube, and I know that we have around 1,000 people or 900. I forget exactly which in the Discord, but I don't believe that every single one of those people maintains a copy of the cube. When I generally point to sort of indications that there's a lot of people who own this cube, I generally will point to the fact that certain cards, specifically Predatory Night Stalker, have kind of been propped up mostly by the existence of the cube in my mind, since that's a card that sees no play anywhere else and still to this day remains like a $5 to $7 card depending on the day of the week. If I had to put like a firm number that I felt really confident on, I would say north of 200 copies of this cube are out there. But again, that's still all guesswork. I've never actually seen a solid quantifiable figure.
Wow, that's a lot of people playing your cube. Here's a question for you. A lot of times when people design their cube, they just think of it as slamming the best cards available inside their cube. Do you feel that that's what the Pauper Cube is, that it's just playing the best commons, or is it more synergy-based? What's the gameplay in the Pauper Cube like?
I think with any cube, you wind up with a little bit of archetype drift over the years where things can come in and out of focus. But when it comes to the design principles here, we're trying to focus more on a really good limited experience rather than the all-time greats. There's a handful of things, for example, that work well in Pauper Constructed that we don't ever anticipate showing up in the cube, namely thinking of stuff like Gush, which is great when you get a lot of them and is great when you have like a very dedicated use for it, but sort of falls apart a little bit more in a limited setting. Instead of just doing the sort of all-time greats, our focus really is on 2-color combinations. We've been having some back and forth lately on exactly what those 2-color combinations are in certain cases. There's been a little bit of muddying with Black X being aristocrats regardless of the other half of that color pair, and we've really been trying to pare that down into Black Red as the main color pair for that. It's mainly 2-color archetypes because that's been one of the guiding principles for actual retail drafts for a long time. So carrying that through hopefully allows this cube to be a nice onboarding point to the wonderful world of cube as a whole, because it still in some ways resembles a retail draft.
Since you mentioned it, and a lot of people are going to be drafting your cube on Magic Online, or I should say a version of your cube, because some of it has been changed and the cube's been buffed for more replayable value. It's a little bigger. But let's take a minute and run through those 2-color archetype pairs for the audience. Azurius runs kind of a tempo game inside this cube, and there's actually a secret blue-white Flyers deck. Shh, don't tell anyone. And then Dimir is your standard control color. And this cube, like most cubes, tends to use gold cards for guideposts. So if you can't remember what you're doing during the draft, just check those gold cards. They'll help point you in the right direction. As you just mentioned, Rakdos is the Sacrifice Aristocrats deck, and Gruul is like a mid-rangey, stompy kind of deck. Selesnya, like in most cubes, is based heavily in tokens, and Orzhov is another Sacrifice Aristocrats color, so you could try and meld the two, Orzhov and Rakdos, and go like a Mardu color if your mana fixing is good enough. Golgari is based heavily in Graveyard Matters, not necessarily recursion, although there is a little bit of that, but mostly a Graveyard Matters style of theme. Simic is a ramp archetype, like it is in a lot of different cubes. And then towards the end, we've got Izzet, which is based in Spells Matter, and Boros, which is the aggro color. And one of the things that I want to point out about these 2-color pairings and about this cube in general is that these archetypes are the same archetypes you're going to see in larger, more traditional, more powerful cubes. So you're still getting that synergy gameplay inside the Pauper Cube that you get in the bigger cube, but the gameplay is just a little different. It's not that uber powerful, I'm going to drop Jace the Mind Sculptor, I'm going to tinker out Sundering Titan. None of that is happening inside the Pauper Cube. The gameplay is just a little more interactive. In fact, Mike, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about maybe your design goals and your gameplay goals for the Pauper Cube in general.
When it comes to specific design goals, obviously we want to push very good, very consistent limited, and we don't want it to be as incredibly sort of in knowledge as possible. We want someone who has, done a handful of retail drafts and done reasonably well at them to be able to look at this cube and go, okay, I see what's happening here. I can piece my way through this. We don't ever kind of want it to become a beginner cube, but I do want it to kind of serve as an on-ramp into the possibilities of cube, because there's not a huge ton of complexity inherently in common cards, and that sort of enables us to have just really, really solid limited play that reflects more of a traditional limited format from a retail set, but just kind of cuts out all that chaff and flattens the power level a little bit. So by helping to flatten out the power curve a little bit, you wind up with a lot more actual games of Magic.
You mentioned flattening out the power curve. Are there any cards that you guys are choosing not to include in the Pauper Cube? Are there any cards that are, quote, banned for power like we might do in our traditional cubes? I know that Pauper common level cards has got to flatten the power level anyway. What are y'all not playing?
There's this one is tough to not sort of show too much behind the curtain, so show a little bit too much of how the sausage is made, but there's nothing that's ever been explicitly banned within our discussions as like strictly off the table. One of the things that for a long time prior to my induction into the committee that I would joke about with Adam is the inclusions of the Karus and Signets, and I do believe that at this point those are never going back in the cube. They represent a very specific type of advantage which is not inherently very easily parsable by newer players, and just really rewards players who have seen the cube before or have seen those cards before. And since we're designing for such a large audience, we don't want to sort of push that as the experience. Like you'll do fine at this draft if you've done it before. Like it's not a great way to get people to draft a cube and then come back to that cube. So yeah, those are really the only ones. There are a couple of cards which have come up recently in discussions about power levels, which I'm not going to get into here, but the only ones that are really solidly off limits are the Karus and Signets, even if we've never like codified that.
So one of the things that I am a huge fan of about this cube is the actual price of this cube. I love having an affordable cube that I can travel with, that I can draft with new drafters and not feel bad about I have to watch every card. And so that's a huge benefit of the Pauper Cube. But I'm wondering if you could tell me, other than price, what are some of the benefits of this cube compared to more traditional cube draft?
One of the big things, as I've mentioned before, is using Cube. This is an onboarding tool for the world of Cube. I do firmly believe that Cube is a different beast entirely than retail limited, and regardless of what type of cube you're working with, barring like maybe a set cube, and even those you're generally doing a little bit of tweaking to maximize the enjoyment of it. So I do like it a lot, in particular as a way to onboard people into this, and also as an owner and organizer, it's a really, really easy way to get people in the door and on board with this. Like I'll be honest, I own multiple cubes at this point. I have owned several over the years, and I do think that this is a great tool for getting people in the door and hopefully giving them a good enough experience that they'll stick around and continue to have fun in what is honestly one of the best formats of Magic.
Okay, Mike, so you mentioned new drafters. this is a pauper environment. There are no titans floating around. So can you give new drafters some tips on like what a bomb actually looks like? What are some good pack one, pick ones? What does a really strong card in the Pauper Cube actually look like?
When it comes to pack one, pick one cards, I generally tell people that things they should be looking for are build-arounds or effects that are just rawly powerful. I tend to be a little bit more in the build-around camp just because this is Cube. I'm not here to win. I'm here to have a good time. But cards like Pestilence, cards like Even Car's Justice, Guardian of the Guild Pact, effects that stand out from the crowd are generally things that I love to first pick and see if I can make them work. And I think that's really the big one. I'll even like one of the often cited ones is the Dimir card Cavern Harpy, which is a really cool build around. It doesn't actually on the card at any point sort of cue you in. It takes a little bit of thought. But playing this in some sort of recursive value-y ETB deck allows you to do some really interesting things with this, like using this to just continuously get back something that's even relatively minimum upside. It doesn't need to be Mold Drifter, but just sort of slowly grinding through a game with this and some other interesting ETB effect. Honestly, love it with a Denrova Horror, but I generally tell people, like, if you're looking for first picks or things that you should pay attention to, if it looks like something you don't recognize as a common, it's probably a reasonable first pick.
Okay, so I'm sitting down at the table then. It's my first draft. Pestilence seems like a big bomb that a lot of people will recognize. What cards are kind of undervalued in the Pauper Cube draft? What are the archetypes that people are sleeping on?
I don't think there's a specific card that gets undervalued, but in general, I feel like a lot of people will undervalue aggro in rarity-restricted cubes. And I think one of the main issues with that is that up until recently, a lot of the more aggressive cards didn't always immediately pass the test for an aggressive card in other formats. We're not talking about like Goblin Guides here. We're saying like, oh, like this 1/1 with slight upside, this is good. Like you should play this. And because of the specific forms of removal, especially at the pauper level that exist, oftentimes going wide is just as valid as going tall in terms of trying to get your opponent down from 20 life as quickly as possible. So I do really feel like a lot of people are missing the boat on aggro cards as a whole. And I do really think that that's something that I have tried to push in my short time on the committee, is making sure that we include good aggressive options. And I still think people are undervaluing them.
All right, so we've talked about undervalued cards. We've talked about pack one, pick ones. Tell me a little more about the gameplay. Is it grindy? Is it value-oriented? Are we looking to do big splashy things? Are all the normal archetypes like aggro, control, and mid-range available? Can you talk to us a little bit about the actual gameplay and the archetypes in general themselves?
I think that when it comes to gameplay, the grind can be very real. I think as part of the nature of a sort of more meat and potatoes draft environment, you're gonna inevitably wind up with situations where you just hit a board stall, no one's doing anything for a few turns, and it just kind of gridlocks. But I think this is also a bit of a result of the fact that there's not a lot of big showy, flashy effects. There's no wraths. There's not a whole ton of 2-for-1s in the cube. And as a result, those gridlocks can occur. I do think that there is a level of play around that. Obviously, cards we mentioned before, Crypt Rats, Pestilence, Even Car's Justice can help break those up. But apart from that, I really like to think that this is a cube that rewards tight, limited play, knowing when to attack, knowing how to pressure your opponent to create board states. And I do think that for a certain segment of the population, that is appealing. Like, one of the ways I've sold a lot of the cubes that I've built that have been rarity restricted are like, this is retail draft, but only the good cards and only one of each of them. And I think in some ways that is deeply appealing to people, is just going, okay, so this is like a booster draft, but I'm not going to see any of those 13th pick stinkers that wind up making my deck because I swapped colors. It's like, no, like you're going to play 23 cards that range from good to great. And I really think that that is one of the core appeals. I think like you don't really see the combo aspect of it. While there are combos you can include, specifically the Ghostly Flicker ones with Peregrine Drake, those aren't always the most efficient, and also from a cube design perspective, they take up a lot of slots. And if they don't come together, sometimes the cards aren't great. A lot of the non-Ghostly Flicker combos get really bad really quickly if you don't find all the pieces. But I do think that aggro, mid-range, and control are still present in their own forms. Aggro definitely still exists as a sort of curve-out, efficient creatures style of deck. Mid-range, obviously, like any draft format, will have some quantity of mid-range, whether it be like intentional or accidental. You just wind up with these decks. Control is sort of the odd one out because the sort of traditional archetype of control within Magic, both in constructed and other cubes and limited formats, control loves like its 2-for-1s, its wraths, its ways of controlling like multiple threats at once. And that's something that's a little bit missing from the Pauper Cube and Pauper Cubes as a whole. Like you see a much more one-to-one style of removal, and that does sort of, I think, up the difficulty when it comes to playing these style of decks, just because you're actively fighting an uphill battle, and a falter in the wrong place and not like using your counterspell in the right spot can sometimes be catastrophic. So I do think that the 3 sort of super archetypes are still present, but they are a little different in their own ways.
Well, Mike, I just want to thank you for taking a minute to answer some of our questions and really walk us through the Pauper Cube. I really feel this is the best cube that people aren't playing. And you can get a copy of the Pauper Cube for, a budget commander deck, only now you can play with 8 of your friends, every week and play some draft and change it, update it. I love this cube. I love to travel with it. The Pauper Cube is amazing. If you're interested in looking over the Pauper Cube list, I've got a link to it in the show notes below. I've also got a link to Tcgplayer if you want to just straight buy a copy of it. I've went ahead and made a link for you. You can just go and purchase a copy of the Pauper Cube. If you just like to draft a copy of it, check it out on Magic Online. It should be up already when this video drops. Leave a comment in the show notes below and just kind of let me know if you like this style of video, if you'd like me to have on more guests, or if you'd like me to walk you through some other cubes. We can certainly do that. You can always catch me on Twitter at cubefortwo. Like, subscribe, ring that little bitty bell so you'll always know when our next video is dropping. And as always, and until next time, shuffle up and keep cubing, my friends.